Welcome back to Psychology 101. This is your instructor, Dr. Shadi Bashai. And in today's lecture, we will continue talking about social psychology. And in specific, we will finish talking about that unit in our third and final section. And the whole unit on social psychology corresponds to chapter 13 of your textbook. So here we go. We talked about how bystander non-intervention works through something called diffusion of responsibility, which is the feeling that when other people are involved, you are, or at least you feel or you perceive yourself to be less responsible for the consequences of non-action. So the concept that I will begin to talk to you about today is a concept called social loafing. And we've all experienced, or at least a lot of us have experienced social loafing when doing something like group projects. We all know that there is at least one person in some groups that simply doesn't contribute to the same level or the same degree as somebody else in the group. And that is social loafing in action, if you will. And it works very much also through the idea of diffusion of responsibility, which is when people there's more than one person involved, and the consequences of behavior are shared amongst a group of people. People feel less responsible about their own actions, and in this particular situation, and in the situation of the bystander non-intervention, they feel less responsible about their non-action, which simply means not doing enough. As you can probably expect, there are cultural differences in the tendency to socially loaf. As expected, collectivist cultures, so cultures that place the needs and the goals of the collective over the needs and the goals of the individual, people from or who are raised in these cultures are less guilty of social loafing than are individuals raised in individualistic cultures. And these are the cultures, individualistic cultures that is, these are the cultures that place the needs and the goals of the individual over the needs and the goals of the collective. So far, we've been discussing negative social influences on people's behavior. There are, however, influences that are benign or even good in nature. And we call any type of behavior that is intended to help other people for completely unselfish reasons altruism. Some research suggests that true altruism, meaning helping people for absolutely no selfish reason at all, may in fact not exist. Some research suggests, for example, that when we do help someone, we get something out of it in some tangible or intangible way, right? So tangible way would be maybe getting a reward, maybe getting social recognition. Intangible rewards, maybe making ourselves feel better for helping others for completely unselfish reasons. So the question is, can true altruism actually exist? And by true altruism, as I've been saying, people helping each other for truly unselfish reasons. The answer may actually depend on people's level of empathy. Now, there's a study that suggests that people's willingness to be altruistic can actually be increased if you increase their empathy, or the ability to almost feel somebody else's emotions or troubles, if you will. And I challenge you to stop the video when you can and watch the little YouTube clip that I have embedded in the slide here, which will walk you through some evolutionary thinking around the idea of altruism. So, what contextual factors predict altruistic behavior? Turns out there are several. As expected, if it's easier to escape a situation where you're offering someone help, turns out that increases people's likelihood of engaging in altruistic behavior. As expected also again, if you're in a good mood, that also increases the chances or the likelihood of people helping one another. And then there's a third contextual factor. If you see a role model or somebody who you perceive is in a role model position to you, and if you see them act in an altruistic manner, that also increases people's ability to act in an altruistic manner. Another important contextual predictor of whether or not you will help is whether or not you have time to help. In a very famous study by Darley and Batson, half the participants were told to prepare a lecture on the story of the Good Samaritan, while the other half of the participants were told to prepare a lecture on what makes them a good student. Okay, and of course, if you're familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan, it's about somebody who stopped to help somebody on the way. Half the participants were told to prepare a lecture on the Good Samaritan. The other half, the story of the Good Samaritan. The other half were asked to prepare a lecture on why they make a good student. And then they were sent on their way and told that they need to arrive at another location where they are to give the lecture that they were assigned to do. And in one group, the researchers told them you only have a few minutes to get there. And in another group, the researchers told them you have plenty of time. You can take your time. It turns out that it didn't matter whether or not people were told to prepare a lecture on the Good Samaritan or about themselves in terms of the likelihood to help someone else. What made the most difference is whether or not people thought they had the time to actually stop and help somebody else. So that's where that particular finding comes from the study by Darley and Batson. And finally now, there's such a thing called the enlightenment effect. And the enlightenment effect is basically any time you learn about things like the bystander non-intervention, things like what things or what factors make people more likely to behave in altruistic or unselfish in an unselfish manner. So just learning about these things actually makes people more likely to engage in helping behavior, which is a very good thing. But with that comes a bit of a responsibility, of course, because now you know, now you understand. Therefore, the onus is on you to be able to help somebody in need, especially when there are a number of people who are around or who are witnesses to these emergency situations. So we talked about contextual factors, but of course there are individual difference factors that predict helping or altruistic behaviors. People who are, for example, less conventional and therefore less concerned with following social customs or social norms, people like that are more likely to help or offer help in an emergency situation. People that are higher on extroversion, and extroversion is a personality trait that makes people energized to be around other people. So extroverts that like or are energized to be around others are more likely to help in an emergency situation. There's also the fact that if you provide people with training on how to help, so for example, first responders know how to help in an emergency situation, and therefore someone like that, even when they're not on duty, they're more likely to help just because of the training that they received on how to help people. There are gender differences, but they interact with situational variables. I'll give you an example of what I mean. So men are more likely, for example, to help people in danger. However, the more dangerous the situation, so the more risk involved, the higher the likelihood that a man will help. Secondly, if a woman is the one who is the victim in the situation, who does need help, men are more likely to offer women that kind of help more than they offer other men. And then here's the other side of the coin, which is aggression, which is behaviors that are intended to harm other people. And much like helping behavior, there are contextual or situational factors that influence aggression, and in this table I discuss a few. For example, any kind of intrapersonal provocation is more likely to get people to lash out and therefore act in an aggressive manner. Further, if people's goals have been frustrated in some way, so people are blocked from reaching whatever goal that they had in mind, hence frustration. Frustration makes people more likely to engage in aggressive manner. And then there are media influences, and some research suggests that media can in fact increase aggressive tendencies. However, the research on this particular topic is relatively mixed, so this is not as clear cut as the rest of them. And I don't know any kind or the presence of aggressive cues in the environment, such as even pictures of knives or guns, can actually prime people to be a little bit more aggressive. Arousal, anything that can attribute to central nervous system arousal, can actually also increase tendencies to be aggressive, and we know that from a few substances that do raise central nervous system arousal levels. Also, substances that inhibit people, or at least inhibit inappropriate behaviors. For example, things like alcohol, it's an inhibitory drug, and therefore it makes people more likely to engage in aggressive acts, for example, because they're less inhibited, which makes sense. Warmer temperatures also increases people's irritability levels, and in turn, their levels of aggression or their tendency to be aggressive. There are, much like altruism, there are individual level predictors of aggressive acts. And this comes from the basic idea that about 5 to 6% of the population actually contributes to more than about 90 to 95% of all crimes. So this tells us that there are, of course, individual differences that make people more or less likely to engage in aggressive behaviors. I'll give you one or a couple at least examples of these. So people who are, for example, higher on negative emotions and impulsivity. And impulsivity is an ability to inhibit one's initial impulses, while negative emotions are things like anger, sadness, anxiety, things like that. So people who are showing impulsivity and heightened negative emotions, and low intimacy levels, meaning that they don't report a lot of significant relationships in their life. People like that tend to be quite aggressive. And then there are, of course, gender differences. Men tend to, on average, again, these are averages and typical trends, men tend to be more physically aggressive than women. However, when you define aggression to be something beyond just physical aggression, and even more specifically, if you start counting instances of when men and women have this indirect or relational forms of aggression. And indirect or relational forms of aggression include things like spreading rumors or spreading lies about somebody to ruin their reputation, for example. Turns out that women are actually higher than men on things like indirect and relational aggression, things that relate to ruining someone's reputation, for example. So women on average are higher than men in that, and if you take indirect or relational aggression into account, the gender differences do actually disappear. There are cultural differences in aggressive behaviors, or at least the tendency to act out. East Asian cultures, just generally speaking, tend to be less aggressive than people raised or people in Western cultures. It turns out also there is a concept called culture of honor, which is defined as a culture in which a person, and this is typically speaking a man, It's a culture in which a man typically, again, feels obligated to protect his or her reputation by answering to insults, for example, or affronts or threats. And sometimes answering insults, threats, etc., is done so in a physically aggressive or violent manner. Okay? So it turns out that cultures of honor, or people higher on this concept of cultures of honor, which is the tendency to want to defend your honor, if you will, also are or have a higher likelihood of engaging in aggressive acts. I want you to take a minute to ponder the following question. Do you think the death penalty is a deterrent to future crime? And how do you feel about the death penalty? So these are, of course, two different questions, but how do they differ? The second one is actually trying to gauge something that social psychologists call attitude about particularly capital punishment. And what attitudes are, they're basically a mixture of a belief, which is this cognition, that has a strong emotional component attached to it. Okay? And for that reason, the second question more pertains to one's attitude about death penalty, the capital punishment, while the first one deters more about cognitions, more in line with what we call a cognition or a thought. And attitudes are really quite important because attitudes tend to be correlated with actual behavior. Okay, so how you think and feel about something is correlated with how you're going to act. That is, if you believe capital punishment is wrong, for example, you are more likely to vote for politicians that are against capital punishment, or at least that show an outward opposition to this particular form of punishment. But how much do attitudes actually matter in predicting behavior? Turns out not a whole lot. So the correlation between attitudes and behavior is only about 0.38, which is significant. But and if you remember the rules about correlation, the closer we get to a score of 1, the stronger the strength of that correlation. And for that reason, the correlation between attitudes and behaviors is what we would call a small to moderate correlation. Okay, so there's a lot of other things that are clearly predicting people's behaviors beyond just their attitudes. And we also know that certain types of attitudes predict behaviors more readily. And an example of that is the availability of these attitudes. And if you remember our first few lectures on the availability heuristic is how easily information comes to your mind, influences your ability to make a decision about how likely this thing to happen. Okay, so that's the availability heuristic, basically how fast something comes to mind. And it turns out that accessible attitudes, the ones that are more available, that are more on the surface of your mind, they tend to have a bigger impact on behavior than less accessible attitudes. It also turns out that people that are higher on self-monitoring, which simply means that you're skilled at observing and regulating your own behavior, people who are higher on this particular trait, as you can probably imagine, don't follow through as much or are less likely to follow through on their attitudes with a particular behavior. So there's less of a connection between their attitudes and their behaviors. Okay, so there are a few even contextual or individual difference factors that predict the relationship between attitudes and beliefs, but overall it's about a 0.38 relationship. So it turns out that our attitudes are at least moderately associated with behavior, so it's important for us to discuss where we get our attitudes from. One source, according to some research, tells us that the more we are exposed to a certain idea or a certain attitude or a certain belief, if you will, the higher the likelihood that we will come to believe that idea to be true. So that is a concept called recognition heuristic and explains at least partially why we get certain attitudes that we get. Just mere exposure, the mere amount of times that we are exposed to these ideas. Another source, of course, is personality. And I want you to consider the following question. Why do political conservatives, that is, people with a conservative bent to their political beliefs, why do political conservatives gravitate toward the death penalty, lower gun control laws, and higher national defenses and things that are similar? And of course, the answer is personality. So research tells us that we get a portion of our attitudes directly from our personality. Where else do we get our attitudes? A very well-known social psychologist by the name of Leon Festinger noticed that people very much like to keep their beliefs and their behaviors very consistent with themselves. And whenever there is some kind of inconsistency that people notice between two beliefs, for example, or two things we believe, or something we believe and something we do, something happens. A state of mental discomfort, if you will, arises that is associated with this discrepancy. And Festinger called this state of mental discomfort that arises when we notice a discrepancy between our beliefs and our behaviors, or our two beliefs, for example. He called it cognitive dissonance. And I want you to imagine you're a research participant in Festinger and Carl Smith's 1959 study on this idea of cognitive dissonance. You show up to the laboratory and you are greeted by a researcher who describes to you what the study will entail. He tells you your task is basically to turn round pegs on a pegboard for about an hour or so. So as you can probably imagine, the majority of participants found this task to be incredibly dull. Half of the participants were compensated $20 for doing this very boring task, and another half of the participants were compensated $1 for doing this boring task. Then after the task was completely done and the participants were paid, the researcher tells everyone involved in the study, so all participants, he tells them, look, we're in a bit of a jam. There's supposed to be a research assistant here that is supposed to help us advertise our study to the next participant who's waiting out in the waiting area now. And unfortunately, the research assistant is very ill and can't help us do this. So can we please ask you to go outside and just tell the next person waiting how much you enjoyed our study here today? It'll really help us out. It'll really help us out if you could do that. Of course, most participants go and do exactly that. So they go after they've been paid and they've done this very boring task. And remember, half of them are paid $20, the other half are paid $1. And so they go and they tell the person waiting out how much they enjoyed doing the task. And then finally, as a final portion to the study, the participants are then asked again about their genuine thoughts and feelings regarding the study, and whether how much they actually enjoyed it for real. And I want you to think with me here. So if you had to guess between the people who got paid $1 to finish the study and lie about the enjoyment level and the people who got paid $20 to do the same, who do you think would report more genuine enjoyment for the study? The people who got paid the $1 or the people who got $20? So it turns out the people who got paid the $1 amount are the ones that actually reported enjoying the study more. And the way the researchers explain this is because getting paid the $20 didn't raise the cognitive dissonance level of these participants enough for them to actually change their beliefs about the actual study. That is, The people that got paid the $1 might have thought, well, I wasn't paid enough to lie about how much I enjoyed this study, so that wasn't the reason why I lied. So I lied probably because I actually do enjoy the study. And that, in fact, is exactly what the researchers found, is that the people who got paid the $1 enjoyed the study more because it created more of that cognitive dissonance because they couldn't justify it just by the payment. So let's make it a bit more real for you here in terms of what cognitive dissonance actually looks like. It's a discrepancy between two cognitions. So there's cognition A, which is I'm an honest person, and there's cognition B, which is I just cheated in my psychology exam. So how do you reconcile this strong dissonance that you feel given the fact that these two cognitions don't align very well? You could change cognition A. So you could say, you know what, maybe I'm not an honest person after all, and that would reduce the cognitive dissonance. Or you can change cognition B. You say, you know what, that wasn't actually cheating, that was something different. That was just accidentally seeing somebody else's answer. That would also reduce the cognitive dissonance. Or you can create a third cognition that reconciles both, which is, I had to cheat on this test because the test maybe was a little unfair. Okay, so that's how cognitive dissonance, at least from Leon Festinger's point of view, works. Cognitive dissonance theory is not the only theory trying to explain how or why people acquire or change their attitudes. There are several others, and I will discuss two of them with you here today. The first is called the self-perception theory, which proposes that instead of attitudes influencing behavior, maybe, just maybe, it's the other way around. And there is a figure here of Bem's idea of the self-perception theory, which is that we actually watch our own behaviors, and our own behaviors then generate a particular attitude afterwards. So we watch our own behaviors, and then in watching our own behaviors or trying to interpret or attribute them, we create a particular attitude. Okay, so that's the self-perception theory. There's the impression management theory, which actually proposes that people don't actually change their attitudes at all, but they may report that their attitudes have changed. And this is basically so that, to appear more consistent in front of others. So impression management theory proposes that we don't change our attitudes at all, but we do report to other people for the sake of maintaining this facade of consistency. We can change our own attitudes, or we can help or persuade someone else to change theirs, and ultimately persuade them to change their behavior. And this is a concept called persuasion. And in the world of persuasion, there's a dominant model, and we call that the dual process model of persuasion. And in the dual process model, there are two levels at which you can actually influence someone's behavior or persuade them to change their attitudes and ultimately their behavior. There's something called the central route of persuasion, and the central route very much relies on how good the content of your message is. Okay, so if the content is good and persuasive and it makes logical sense, it will influence people's behaviors. And then, of course, there's the peripheral route, which is more surface level aspects of the argument that have very little to do with the logicalness of that argument or the content being proposed. And these peripheral type variables include things like the attractiveness, for example, of the person giving you the message. When we're strapped for time, it turns out that we rely more heavily on the peripheral or the surface level to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to change their behavior. So peripheral pathways, even though it sounds superficial, which it really is, can actually be a very powerful mode of changing someone's behavior, at least in the short term. So there are several techniques that are used to persuade others of a certain idea, so a certain attitude, and ultimately persuade them to change their behaviors. Some of these techniques include something like the foot in the door technique, which is a type of technique, and all of these techniques, by the way, are called sequential request methods, okay, in terms of their ability to persuade someone else. And I bet you they're used ubiquitously. You know, if you go to your local car dealership, for example, I bet you the car salesman will use a few of these on you. So the first of which, as mentioned, is the foot in the door technique, which starts out with a small request. And if people are okay with doing a small request, turns out that there's a higher likelihood for actually acquiescing to a larger request after that. Okay, and there are a number of studies, for example, that show that, where you ask people to do this small little favor, and then getting your foot in the door that way makes them more likely to agree to even larger favor later on. And there's the opposite technique, if you will, which is called the door in the face technique, which starts out with a very big request. So you say to your friend, for example, "Can I please have $5,000? And most people would say no to that request because it's far too large. But then the person making the request makes it a much smaller request. You say, you know what? Okay, $5,000 is a lot. How about I have $20? And just by anchoring it initially to this really large request, people are more likely to agree to a smaller request after that, after having the door in the face initially. And then finally, there's another sequential request method of persuasion that is often used to change people's attitudes and ultimately their behavior, and it's called the lowball technique, which is starting out with a low price, if you will, give them an attractive low price that is never really actually followed on. So after a little while, they say, "Oh, we know we offered you this really low deal, but there are add-ons that we need to put on." So instead of getting the low price that you actually agreed upon, they give you a much larger price, but because you already agreed, you're more likely to agree to that, even to the add-ons with all the desirable options, but that cost you more. We talked about that pesky peripheral route to persuasion, which is the level of persuasion that it has little to do with the actual content or the logicalness of the message, and more to do with more peripheral things. Okay, so it really means that you're paying more attention to the optics of the message and the messenger than you are to the actual content related to the message. So it means that the person trying to persuade you will impact the likelihood of this persuasion, and it can be quite effective in persuading people to change their behaviors. And these variables that I've been talking about include how attractive or famous the person trying to sell you the message is. Okay, so that's has very much to do with the peripheral route of persuasion. How credible you believe the person to be. Again, has very little to do with the content or the logic of the message that they're trying to get across, and very much to do with how they dress up that message. And also another peripheral route of persuasion is how similar the messenger is, the person giving you or trying to persuade you, to the receiver. How similar you are to each other, turns out predicts whether or not you will follow through on a persuasive argument. Take a minute to consider the following. Women are more likely to marry men who share the first letter of their pre-marriage last name, for example. People are more likely to live in cities that include their birthday number. So I'll give you one example here. People born on the 3rd of March, for example, are more likely than others to live in towns that have 3 in them. So 3 Rivers, Michigan. And so on and so forth. You see all of these examples. We call this particular effect implicit egotism, which shows us how incredibly biased our social nature can be. And it's this desire to associate with anything that resembles us. And that's really what implicit egotism is our desire to associate or be lumped in together, and our perception that anything that looks or is similar to us is better. Okay, so it's our desire to associate with anything that's similar to us, but also the belief that anything that's similar to us must in fact be better. This idea of us versus them, group membership, is really the basis of many instances of prejudice and discrimination. And prejudice is defined as any attitude or a negative conclusion, let's say about a group of people, for example, that you arrive at without actually evaluating the complete evidence. Okay, so that's what prejudice is. It's jumping to mostly negative conclusions without any evidence. Discrimination, on the other hand, is when that particular prejudiced idea about a particular group of people, for example, spills over into discriminatory behavior. So now you're actually denying them opportunities, for example, if you're an employer who's hiring. Just to give you one example of discrimination. So prejudice has to do with beliefs. Discrimination has to do with actual behavior. Stereotypes, on the other hand, are any overgeneral beliefs, if you will, about a particular group of people. Okay, so all so and so are good at this, or all so and so are bad at this. So this is just an example of what stereotypes might look like. And much like heuristics, and we've talked about this concept ad nauseum, especially early on in our lectures. Much like heuristics, beliefs can sometimes be accurate, so stereotypic beliefs can be accurate, but because they are overgeneral, they tend to oversimplify reality, and therefore they make us more likely to make mistakes if we're relying on these stereotypes to make a particular decision, or to believe something, or to make a particular connection with a behavior. Sometimes we maintain these stereotypes through something called illusory correlations. So the belief that two things are actually correlated when they're not at all. And sometimes it happens through the mother of all cognitive biases. We call this the confirmation bias, which is the tendency to only look for evidence to support your own ideas and to dismiss evidence that is against, or that disconfirms your original ideas. Okay, so these types of overgeneral, often inaccurate stereotypes are maintained through these two forces. And stereotypes can result in something called the ultimate attribution error. And if you remember the fundamental attribution error, which is to attribute someone's behavior to internal negative causes. So if they cut you off on the road, it's because they're an a-hole, for example. So the ultimate attribution error is to try to understand a group of people's behavior through internal, mostly negative dispositional factors. Okay, so it's not about an individual, it's about a group of people, and you make that assumption about a group of people. Again, you assume that they're doing something because of some kind of an internal drive or some kind of a dispositional personality factor. Meaning that when people of the outgroup do something bad, or we assume is bad, we attribute that to internal causes. When they do something good, we attribute that to some kind of an external force. So it's a no-win situation, if you will, for members for people who you perceive as being part of the outgroup. According to, again, a very famous social psychologist by the name of Henry Tajfel, so according to social identity theory, our group memberships very much help us define or understand who we are. This type of sense of belonging to a particular group gives people a sense of security, a sense of purpose. That is, groups usually outsurvive their members. Okay, so whatever group that you belong to, chances are it's going to outlive you. So they give people a sense of transcendence, if you will. For all of these reasons, when we feel like we belong, our self-esteem tends to go up. Our confidence tends to enhance. So if group membership can be a positive thing, why are we so prejudiced then? We call this effect the in-group bias, or the tendency to favor people who we perceive as part of our group, and the tendency to disparage or to put down anyone who we perceive to be part of the outgroup, or they're outsiders, if you will. And this type of in-group, out-group dynamic is often so automatic that we don't even notice it happening at all. And I want you to take a minute here, when you can, to watch the embedded YouTube clip, which will give you an example of what I'm talking about. Sometimes we don't even know that we're part of groups, yet our in-group and out-group ideas really do influence our behaviors. Okay? So it's often so automatic that we don't even notice it sometimes. And oftentimes we create in-groups and out-groups based on very arbitrary lines, just as as arbitrary as the skin color that somebody has, for example, as arbitrary as a hair color that somebody has. Okay, so the notions of in-group and out-group can be extremely arbitrary, and they have very powerful effects over how we behave and the type of cognitions that we have. So again, why are we so prejudiced? And there are a few hypotheses that have been forwarded to try and understand why people are as prejudiced as they are. The first of which is called the scapegoat hypothesis, which simply says that when there's limited resources and or when we're experiencing some kind of misfortune, we tend to blame other people for our bad luck, basically. Okay, so that's the scapegoat hypothesis. We use other people, the people lumped in as others, as some kind of a scapegoat. There's the just world hypothesis, which is another explanation as to why we're so prejudiced and we hang on to our prejudiced beliefs. And this is when we believe that the world is an incredibly fair place. So anytime we see the misfortunes of someone else, we think, well, they did it to themselves. It's a blame the victim type of mentality. Okay, so if you believe the world is fair, you blame the victim during their own misfortunes. So if the world is fair and just, then people must be the architects of their own misfortune, if you will. Finally, we hold prejudiced ideas or prejudiced beliefs because maybe people in our circle, people who we perceive as members of the in-group, hold these bad ideas, and we understand all too well how strong of an influence conformity can be, which is just going along with what the crowd wants you to believe. So based on these ideas, we can be quite prejudiced to people who we perceive as being part of the outgroup. How do we stop prejudice? Another famous psychologist by the name of Mozarif Sharif conducted several experiments with school-aged children. And his experiments give us some insights as to how we can actually stop prejudice. His study participants were all school-aged boys who were essentially the same on a number of socioeconomic variables. So they're pretty much the same age, same race, same culture, from relatively the same socioeconomic background. And during a retreat, Mozarif Sharif and his colleagues divided these kids into two arbitrary groups just based on a flip of a coin. And then he had these two teams go through a series of phases, and in fact 3 phases particularly. In the first phase, he created an atmosphere where the boys would bond with each other within their own respective team. Okay. In the second phase, Mozarif got the two teams to compete over limited resource. So they were competing for rewards and things like that. And then finally, in the third phase, he brought the children together to solve what he called superordinate goals. And these are the goals that transcend group memberships. So these are the goals that all members of society, regardless of which group they find themselves in, must address in order to achieve a particular superordinate goal. So people have to band together, if you will, and forget about the artificial divides. So he found that prejudice and discrimination increased very much during phase 2, the phase in which people were competing for limited resources. So that gives us an insight as to why people sometimes hold on to prejudiced beliefs. It's maybe they're competing for very limited resources, and during this time, animosity is built. But what Mozart found is that the levels of prejudice and discrimination that the boys demonstrated in phase 2 almost completely vanished at the third stage, when all the members were working together to solve these superordinate goals. Particular study is an inspiration for a type of classroom technique called the jigsaw classroom. And this is when teachers give several pieces of a puzzle, if you will, to students in a classroom, regardless of whatever social group that they're in, and then students have to come together, disregard their differences, to solve the puzzle. Until next time.